Hello, Making Sense listeners. Today, we're handing over the feed to EMEA in Conversation, a new JP Morgan podcast featuring in-depth interviews with industry leaders on what's happening across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Making Sense will return to its regular schedule on Friday, February 20th, as we unpack the latest data from the CPI report. But for now, enjoy this special episode from JP Morgan's EMEA in Conversation.
Whether you're a business leader, investor, or just curious about what's next, this is your front row seat to the future of EMEA. Welcome to EMEA in Conversation. Hi, I'm Ambar Morshed and I head up Subsidiary Payment Sales for EMEA. And I'm joined by James Fraser here today, who heads up JP Morgan EMEA Payments.
Great to be here, Amber.
So James, when we think of the Middle East, it's often thought of as high energy, a lot of opportunity, a lot of investment. But if you had one word that you think could summarize the Middle East, what do you think that would be?
For me, I'd say transformative. Right? I think you can see it, you can feel it when you're there. There's a lot of activity. You literally visualize it through, worse traffic, more construction cranes. It's obviously very dynamic, and you have a lot of compete in the region. You have different countries at sort of different stages overall in terms of what their end ambitions are. But, as you kind of travel around, that is sort of the common denominator.
James, I couldn't agree with you more. If we really think back 20 years ago, and if we think of ADGM, it was a desert back then. And now it's an actual global financial center for us. So when I really think about the Middle East at the moment, there's real momentum that's really growing there. And actually, that's a really good segue introducing our next topic. When we really think about from where you sit today, why do you think there's growing interest into the Middle East? Given obviously a lot of factors around long-term investment, long-term structural investment that's going into the region. If we think about places like Saudi Arabia, there's obviously a lot of political reform that's also going into the region as well. But from where you sit today, why do you think that surge of interest is arising?
I think, there's a multitude of factors. I think when you look at the underlying policies that are being pursued by several of these nations we've already covered, there's a strategic angle, which is, dates back sort of multiple decades. Certainly in the case of UAE, when they sort of had a vision around becoming much more of a logistics hub, and they, first plan, I think it was 1979, the Jebel Ali port, which is the largest man-made port in the world. There was a vision of creating sort of that economic free zone and attracting investment and ultimately driving a level of diversification away from hydrocarbons. And you can kind of see that vision really start to play out. And you can see that very particularly in Saudi, sort of the Vision 2030, it's investments around technology, critical industries like healthcare, critical minerals, defense. So it's really harnessing AI. It's really kind of harnessing where the demand is going to be the next 5-10 years. And then, so that's sort of the local vision and strategy that you just kind of see this gradual execution. And then you overlay what's really been happening geopolitically. And you see a lot more sort of east to east trade and west to west trade versus global trade. So trade still continues to grow, but the corridors are shifting, and the Middle East is sort of recapturing that old history dating back to sort of Silk Road 70, 80 generations ago. And they're making the most of that opportunity. So they're growing trade with Asia, they're growing trade with Europe, and they're growing trade with the United States. And that sort of vision around the logistics hub is really coming to life. And so that's a massive, massive tailwind that I think when you step back, you say these are kind of secular trends where we don't really expect a significant reversal. And so it gives you that view that what we've seen the last 10 years around that transition and investment into new sectors is here to stay.
That makes sense. And actually, if you think about the Middle Eastern market relatively, and if you look at particularly in Saudi, I think there are just over 20 financial institutions that are actually registered with SAMA at the moment. So if you think about what that opportunity really represents for new entrants into the market, for fintechs to enter into the market, I think is huge. I know it was publicly announced that Amazon Web Services are actually building data centers there in the region. And again, this is a real common thing that we're seeing from FDI that's actually coming into the region as well.
Yeah, that's right. But we've also seen kind of heavy adoption of digital money. And there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of demand for global innovation around financial products. We've seen significant uptake among sort of Middle Eastern-based banks for tokenized deposits as kind of one example. The region really stands out for the amount of global remittances. So they're kind of averaging 125 billion annually and growing, at a pretty healthy rate. So I think the demand for those innovative products and easy to use products, I think combined with the amount of investment that's going into financial services and fintechs explicitly kind of within their individual countries' ecosystems, again, is a really favorable setup. And you have to believe that the early adoption will occur in some of these countries. And really, again, it's just helps sort of set the solid foundation for that next leg of growth.
So James, when we think about the Middle East and really the opportunity that exists out there, both in terms of long-term investment, attracting talent, why do you think that is? What do you think some of the factors are that are really attracting businesses and companies to the region?
I think first it comes back to sort of the infrastructure, right? And it can be as basic as the rule of law. We've generally seen a lot of, particularly these kind of economic free zones, adopting English law standards, and you can see that's how kind of cases get played out in the courts. So commercially, when you look at the opportunity, if you're deploying increased kind of footprint and talent on the ground, you can sort of do that with confidence. We've seen a lot of growth certainly on the private wealth side, and a lot of asset managers moving folks could be from Miami, London, other parts of Europe. And so I think that trend is a really reflection of what's going on at the ground and really the value proposition, particularly for employees looking to work there.
So I think we've definitely seen a rise in Asian companies entering into the region as well, and they've done investments there. But what is also interesting is they also share feedback that there are some challenges. And if we think about banking interoperability, there's still a little bit of fragmented regulation across each of the markets as well. There's also different currency jurisdictions and controls that they also have to abide by as well, depending on the market itself. And another final piece is that obviously if we think about the maturity of a lot of these companies that are entering the market, we're still in kind of that initial phase. But I mean, there's definitely been speed there in the last 20 years, but there's definitely another journey to go.
I agree. It's certainly not a finished product. And I think you have to look at it a little bit sort of market by market, because they all started their journeys at sort of different points. But I think you raise, a key question, I think, around particularly the interoperability. And I think that is a reflection somewhat of kind of the legacy infrastructure, the legacy regulation. And so, we referenced earlier, there's a lot of demand for digital money and sort of that sort of next generation of financial services. But the reality is you need, a highly constructive, supportive, regulatory environment in order to really thrive. And again, I think different countries are really at different states, and ultimately the frameworks need to evolve to meet the ambition.
So, James, we've definitely seen a shift, I think, in the last 5 years, where if we looked at what businesses and corporates were doing in the region in terms of treasury transformation, it was very much about how do they centralize funds within the Middle East, or how do they repatriate back to headquarters. And so it was very kind of traditional led. Now, if we've kind of shifted on 5 years from that, well, what we're really seeing in the market is this kind of rise in this demand for virtual accounts, B2B marketplaces. We've seen a ton of new entrants into the market. We talked about Amazon earlier, but we've seen AliExpress come into the market, Uber as well. And a lot of these new large entrants that are coming into the market are kind of driving the way that corporates and fintechs are reacting to those new entrants. What do you think is kind of stemming some of that change that's happening in the region?
I think, when you look at certainly the B2C side of payments and even lending, they really are quite advanced. And I think part of that is a reflection of a dynamic, growing youth population and significant uptake in things like mobile payments. and ties back to the comment earlier on global remittance activity. So I think the demand is there kind of generally across the population on the consumer side. So you've seen some really innovative fintechs come up, enter the market, and some of which are homegrown to meet the demand for consumers. And I think, as you know, there really is this shift now on the B2B side where there is demand for things like real-time payments, for virtual accounts. And I think, again, the regulatory authorities in some of these key markets see those trends. They want to reinforce them, support them. And I think that explains some of the demand we've seen for certainly tokenized deposits. So the speed at which you can move money, the ease, the traceability, the visibility are all really factors in play. I think the other interesting element, and we've seen this particularly in the Saudi market, is a growing level of support and demand for extending working capital solutions throughout the ecosystem. So if they have visions on certain industries becoming increasingly dominant, there's a recognition that you have to support the entire supply chain, and particularly, SMEs that are homegrown. And so there are innovative platforms that are being stood up to support, working capital lending into those SMEs and just build, more supply chain resilience. So it really is that sort of end-to-end view from SMEs to large enterprises, back all the way to consumers. And how do we make that a very, supportive, dynamic environment?
You just hit all the points of the ecosystem that we see there, right? From true heavy industry, supply chain, back down to the consumer. So James, looking ahead, we've talked a lot about the opportunity that we really see in the Middle East, but what do you think really are some of the risks or the possible disruptions that we could see looking ahead?
We touched on earlier what's driving kind of the current level of growth, and there's what's being sort of planned and executed at the local level, which is generating obviously a lot of the incremental investment and growth, et cetera. And then there's the sort of macro geopolitical landscape that's shifted, and they are one of the primary beneficiaries of that globally. So I think when you think through what could be an unanticipated headwind, I think it would be potentially that sort of an end to some of these secular trends away from globalization or a trend around de-globalization. I don't think it fundamentally changes the end state or the long-term prospects, but that's been clearly a near-term driver. I think the planned investments, particularly on the logistics side, some of the advantages we covered earlier in areas like AI and technology, those are here to stay. Those are economic benefits that I think companies that are either established there or moving into the Middle East will have for a long period of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, is that even though there could be possible further disruption that's out there, what's interesting is that actually they've set themselves up for long-term investment. I mean, even if you looked at what they're doing in Saudi Arabia, I mean, that long-term investment that they've put down there, it gives an element of certainty, right? They've put that investment in, they're building it, so it's still going to attract. So no matter kind of what the disruptions lay out there, it could slow it down, but that long-term investment is there already.
That's right. And I think when it comes to long-term CapEx and infrastructure, you always have the lever to pull of slowing down. And that's, that will be a tool that can be used. But I think the fundamental drivers kind of near term of some of the key industries where we've seen investment and we're seeing growth, those are foundational, and I think really will provide growth for the next decade and beyond.
So James, if you think there's one conversation that you think people should be having about the Middle East right now, what would that be, and why?
I think if you've spent time in the region, I spent a lot of time in the region the last 5 years, you really get an appreciation for some of these fundamental dynamics. But I think they're still fighting perceptions, right? Where everyone's sort of subject to recency bias. So I think, we see some corporates in particular and multinationals, they understand the dynamics, they're moving quickly, or where they see an opportunity. I think we've seen that again a little bit, more broadly within financial services and areas like asset management. But I think that recency bias is still, an issue globally. So I don't think there's wide recognition of sort of that growth and equity opportunity that exists. Because if you haven't been there and you haven't seen it and you don't understand it, you will think through the last 50 years, it is oil reserves, and yes, there's investment that's occurring, and it's a place to go attract investment for areas such as private equity. But the reality is those equity opportunities, it's not just finding the funding; the opportunities will exist on the ground, and I think that is not a widely known or appreciated fact. I think we've seen a lot of movement in the last 3 or 4 years, but I still think there's a bit of a journey there, and it'll be, it'll take time.
I think the shift that's now happening is actually quite rightly what you said, is actually the on-the-ground activity and the actually on-the-ground investment that we're seeing today. Now, super interesting. James, thank you so much for joining us as a part of this conversation here today. Of course, this is a first part in a multi-series dialogue called EMEA in Conversation. The second part of this series will be coming up shortly, focused on Europe, and I hope you'll all tune in for that.
Copyright 2026, JP Morgan Chase & Co. All rights reserved. JP Morgan Chase Bank, N.A, member of FDIC. Deposits held in non-US branches are not FDIC insured. Non-deposit products are not FDIC insured. All rights reserved. The statements herein are confidential and proprietary and not intended to be legally binding. Not all products and services are available in all geographical areas. Visit jpmorgan.com/payments disclosure for further disclosures and disclaimers related to this content. The video podcast guide is confidential and proprietary to JP Morgan and is provided for your general information only. It is subject to change without notice and is not intended to be legally binding. Any services described in this video podcast guide are subject to applicable laws and regulations and service terms. Not all products and services are available in all locations. Eligibility for particular products and services will be determined by JP Morgan Chase Bank, N.A, or its affiliates. JP Morgan makes no representations as to the legal, regulatory, tax, or accounting implications of the matters referred to herein. Any mentions of third-party trademarks, brand names, products, and services are for referential purposes only, and any mention thereof is not meant to imply any sponsorship, endorsement, or affiliation. JP Morgan and JP Morgan Payments are marketing names for certain businesses of JP Morgan Chase & Co. and its affiliates and subsidiaries worldwide. JP Morgan Chase, N.A, organized under the laws of USA with limited liability. The views and opinions expressed herein are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of JP Morgan, its affiliates, or its employees. The information set forth herein has been obtained or derived from sources believed to be reliable. Neither the author nor JP Morgan has any representations or warranties as to the information's accuracy or completeness. The information contained herein has been provided solely for the informational purposes and does not contribute to an offer, solicitation, advice or recommendation to make any investment decisions or purchase any financial instruments and may not be construed as such.